has overshadowed Stuart to some extent, being a Beatle. But there is another argument. I've met people who've said to me, I wouldn't have minded being a Beatle, and other people have said I wouldn't have minded being a painter as good as he was.
Love me do.
I frankly think the Beatles association is incidental. He is almost an exemplary, tragic, romantic artist. I think he would have been major had he survived.
The birth of the Beatles wasn't just about Liverpool wit and the volatile relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The Beatle Boys became men in the seedy German port of Hamburg. And it was the Beatles' original bassist, John Lennon's best friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who primarily influenced the group's early style. Lennon and Sutcliffe's passionate relationship ended when Sutcliffe died at the age of just 21.
When you're young, death is so far away, you don't think about it. Never the thought gets in your mind, this young man, full of life, could drop dead.
She's like a rose that's run its dark leaves over the wall to look at the sun. In rebellion or bewilderment, almost definitely want to get painting again. I see so
This is the story of a potentially significant artist who left the Beatles to become a painter, but who never got to fulfil his potential. It's also a great 20th century love story, told here in Sutcliffe's own words and the words of those closest to the lost Beatle.
I do love a girl, but I'll speak little of her, for my mind would overflow with tenderness.
He could write things like that without being pathetic. In moments like that, I wish he would be here.
I think the thing I miss most about my brother as a painter is being able to ask him about his work now. You know, why did he use this silver paint here? You know, what do these symbols really mean?
Stuart was a very important person. In the midst of all this sordidness and muck, there was a magical thing going on.
It was amazing to see somebody who actually had so many things happening in his head. I mean, it might sound strange, but to me, it seemed to be as if his life was compressed into a short moment.
Stuart was born in Edinburgh in 1940, and when he was about 2, the family moved to Liverpool. When he was about 8 or 9, he became a choir boy at Highton Parish Church, and eventually was leading chorister. He'd always loved music, but equally loved art as well. And a little later he enrolled at the Liverpool College of Art.
There was evidence here of the artistic abilities that would blossom later in Hamburg. And at 16, much younger than the other students, Stuart was introduced to a tantalising new social life.
Stuart and I first met lining up to sign on at the college in September, October, sometime like that, in '56. And Paul McCartney went to the institute next door with George. As soon as we'd signed on, we'd already started chattering away to each other in the queue. We were taken across to the crack by one of the other students, second year I think, and introduced to the famous pub. John Lennon came to the art college in '57 and after signing in found his way immediately to the crack, which I suppose was like a homing instinct. Stuart and I decided very early on in the college course that we needed a place of our own to keep our work, to work after hours. After all, you know, if we were going to be proper artists, we wanted to be working 24 hours a day. And it seemed to be the thing to have a studio.
Mother actively encouraged Rod to look with Stuart and find somewhere for them to have a studio, because she didn't think that there was sufficient space for him at home. And furthermore, she was an asthmatic, and the actual oil paint wasn't good for her chest. At the time, it stood up as an incredibly good reason for a 16-year-old to be leaving home.
Stuart did masses of work here. The place was absolutely stuffed with paintings.
And that was another reason why Mother wanted him to have a studio, because he would paint quite late into the night at home, which wasn't really fair on the rest of the family, because we were just young girls and Mother was teaching, so we all had to be up early. But that was his habit from very, very early on.
This was the ace place for taking young ladies to, because you'd tell them that there was a party on and bring them back to number 9, where if you were lucky, you copped off. Stuart would do portraits of the girlfriend of the time. It wasn't politically good to have portraits of previous girlfriends knocking around, so they'd be whitened over and then the next one painted over the top. Gambier Terrace was the last flat we had. When we left Percy Street for one reason or another, partly due to being caught burning the furniture to keep warm, we moved, not very smart of us, was it, if we didn't want to be caught, but we moved just round the corner to Gambier Terrace, and we were flat 3, which was the first floor. Those large windows just there. You can actually see the back of Gambier Terrace here, which is the room that Stuart and John shared. They had a bed on either side of that room, plus easels, enormous paintings, so on.
When John moved in, a relationship began that would dominate the rest of Stuart's life.
I thought he was quite an unusual friend for my brother to have, because I was used to people like Rod, you know, who were very sociable and parent-friendly. And John really wasn't like that at all.
I think until you got to know him, he looked and appeared to be quite an aggressive, rough sort of character. But I think that a lot of that was a front. I think John was, once he decided you were friends, would stick by you. And I think he was sure that Stuart was a friend. I like to think that he thought I was.
He was self-centred, yet at the same time he was always a loyal friend. A frustrated and misunderstood child, not given its due need of affection, ends as a man without roots. In rebellion or bewilderment, almost embittered. This was John.
From the I would guess, mid-58 to early 59s, I think they got closer, largely because of their interest in music. John was in the band before he even got to the college, the Quarrymen, and he carried on playing all the time he was at college. We used to all go around watching whenever they had gigs, you know. Paul and George joined, and then Stuart. I'm here at the Museum of Liverpool Life to see Stuart's guitar, his acoustic guitar, not his bass guitar, unfortunately. I haven't got that. Well, if this is the same guitar that Stuart had in Percy Street, I haven't seen it for 45 years. Yes, this looks like the one Stuart had in the flat in Percy Street. which I think I've got a photograph of, with a friend at the college strumming away on it. It was there that John asked Stuart and I would either of us like to be the bass guitarist, and I started to make one, which I still haven't finished. It would sound better if it had strings on. And Stuart, luckily, had got a painting in the John Moores exhibition, and John Moores bought the painting. Stuart suddenly had some money, and he bought the guitar, so he got the job. And he became the bass guitarist of the Beatles. But it's nice to see this again. It's almost like a little shrine, like a coffin almost. It's great after all these years. Hardly worth finishing this now, I suppose.
In 3 years' time, the Beatles would be the most famous pop group in the world. To first become the most famous group in Liverpool, they needed a manager.
I knew that they were from the art school. That was Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon. And they decorated the basement for me. Some of the paintings behind me now, some of them are still original paintings of Stuart and John. I didn't even know they had a group. John and Stuart approached me and said, "Hey Al, when are you going to do something for us like?" I said, "Well, there's no more decorating, lads, you know, you've done it." He said, "No, we've got a group." I said, "Well, I didn't know that." I said, "Where do you play?" He said, "We play the art school every Saturday." I said, "Oh, well, that's interesting." I said, "What's the lineup?" And it became obvious that they didn't have a drummer. And then we went through about 3 drummers before we settled for Pete Best.
To the surprise of these insular art school kids, cosy in a hometown they had hardly left, their new manager wanted to dispatch the newly christened Beatles to be the resident band in a tiny nightclub down a dubious backstreet in Hamburg.
How Hamburg came about was I had a group working there already, and the Beatles had no money. They said, "We haven't got the money for the train fare or the boat." And I said, "Well, okay then." I had a minibus. I said, "I'll take you all in a minibus."
My mother and my sister and I went down into Liverpool, where they were leaving from, incognito, I might add. Stuart had no idea we were there. She didn't want to embarrass him in front of his friends. And we watched them load the van, and my mother wept for the whole time.
The next 2 years were spent mostly in Hamburg, where playing up to 6 hours a night would turn the group from energetic amateurs into ballsy apprentice superstars. The Beatles were speeding towards history, and the first major players in a drama were Stuart and John.
Hamburg was so wild. It was a 24-hour non-stop entertainment there. I think we got to Hamburg round about 1 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, this is the Indra Club. This is the club where the Beatles start playing when they came to Hamburg. I think you can still... On the 7th of August, 60, the Beatles came in here and played on the stage of the Indra Club. It was their first German engagement, and this is the club.
There was a stripper on stage, and they said, "Oh my God," because John and Stuart and Paul had already played in a strip club in Liverpool, and they said, "Oh no, we haven't come to Hamburg to back a stripper, Alan, you know." So I said to Koshmi there, who owned it, he said, "No, this is last night was stripper, tomorrow is rock and roll." Grocer Fright on the Reaper band was just club on top of clubs. There'd be a club in the basement, there'd be a club on the ground floor, there'd be a club on the first floor, and this was the whole street with flashing lights in the ends. They were just gobsmacked.
Hamburg has little quality, except the kind you'd find in a test tube of sewer water. It's nothing but a vast immoral jungle.
Hell, mama, don't you treat me wrong. Come and love your daddy all night long, all right now.
strippers, hookers, queers, transvestites, and this mixed musicians and sailors and foreigners and tourists, and it was a big melting pot in Hamburg.
And that's where they got the first dose of gonorrhea.
Sweet little 16, she's got the grown-up blues. It's tight dresses and lipstick.
The Kaiserkeller was the second club wherever the Beatles played in Hamburg. The entrance is still the same, like it was in the early days.
I came down the Große Freiheit and I heard live music, and it sounded ridiculously good. I went down and sat down at a table, and then they started playing. And that was just incredible. It blew me away.
As Klaus Vormann's illustrations reveal, the Beatles were now fixtures at the Kaiserkeller, also run by Bruno Kosmider. Superficially respectable and charming, he was ruthless when it came to dealing with bands.
Kosmider was a disabled person. He had a stiff leg, but also he had always a chair leg here where he's stiff-legged to hit people on the head. For my opinion, money was everything for him, and he treated the bands bad.
Hell, mama, don't you treat me wrong. Come on, love your daddy all night long, all right now.
The place they stayed in was at the Bambi Kino. The Bambi Kino is a cinema which is a sort of soft porno movie, you would call it today. Kosmider put the bed in there, and there was no windows. You just had the light bulb. You had no wardrobe. You had no wash basin or anything. If they wanted to go and wash, they had to go to the men's toilet of the cinema. So when they got up in the afternoon, it could very well happen that they were actually having their wash, whilst next to them a guy was standing having a piss.
The door to the Bambi Kino was that door. There were no bedrooms, no nothing. They only had mattresses on the floor, and they put a big line across the room to put their clothes, to hang their clothes, because there was no wardrobe, no nothing, no chairs, no nothing. And they stayed there like tramps, you know. And when I think about it, I still get mad to this Kosmider bastard. But maybe they had to go to this all to become what they were on the end, the biggest in the world. But here where it starts.
In his letters home, Stuart reveals the sensitivities of someone interested not just in art, but philosophy, literature, and the world around him.
Have I told you that I sleep in a cinema? The time is 5:20 a.m. and I'm worn out. I can't believe I'm not at college. If I had great musical sense, I could place tin cans around the room, all different sizes, and as the rain fell in, I could arrange it so that I composed a little tune. But I'm more content to just listen to the dull thuds and thwacks the raindrops make as they hit the floor and the bed.
They were in the Kaiserkeller, and at midnight they had a half-hour break. Now, there was another club round the corner called the Top 10, and this Londoner, Tony Sheridan, worked there. And they learned a lot from Tony Sheridan because he was a brilliant guitar player and also had a very good voice.
In the Top 10, when I was sort of the house singer there, I was asked to sort of, when the group went back, the one I was playing with at the time, I was asked to sort of play with somebody else. Like, well, who have you got? Then the next group that came along was a group called the Beatles, and I said, well, yeah, I know these. We met, of course, yeah, well, okay, well, let's try it with them for a few months. So they were brought in, and I was there already, so we just did it. If you had something, you had a bit of talent, you got good in Hamburg, because you had to sort of work all night and develop it. And they got good.
Even now, a lot of people say to me, how do you become a Beatle? I said, well, first of all, you go to Hamburg, you work 7 nights a week, the playing times are something like 7 and 8 hours at the weekends, and you do that for 5 months, and that will either make or break. That's where they learnt the trade. It wasn't Liverpool that made the Beatles.
We have improved 1,000-fold since our arrival, and Alan Williams tells us that there is no band in Liverpool to touch us. Our biggest numbers being What I Say, Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Lucille, Sweet Little 16, Johnny Be Good, 3 Steps to Heaven, and quite a few more.
Sweet little 16, she's got the grown-up blues.
They were playing such long hours, and when they finished work, maybe at 3 o'clock, other clubs were opening for the people who were in the entertainment, and they came hooked on amphetamines.
We discovered if you have 5 beers and 2 pills, the effect is very good for playing music. We discovered that. And keeping awake, of course.
You start with 1 pill for the night, that helps. You know, you could drink a lot, you were very lively, and later on you took more, you know. I couldn't tell one musician who didn't take Preludin.
There would be a woman who controlled the toilet, and she'd have these pills and selling to the groups. But that's all it was. It was only amphetamines to keep them awake, basically.
If it wasn't the rock and roll or the drugs that were keeping you awake, it would be the sex.
Of course, the girls, they were looking for the musician. That was like today, the groupies.
Sex was freely available to all the groups, but what the groups didn't know, well, most of them were prostitutes.
We had a lot of prostitutes in Hamburg, and of course they went there too.
I mean, you obviously need a little warmth from somebody, you know, preferably the other sex, you know what I'm saying?
Recently, I've become very popular with both girls and homosexuals who tell me I'm the sweetest, most beautiful boy. Imagine it, me, the one who had such a complex because I was small and thought I was ugly. It appears that people refer to me as the James Dean of Hamburg. I'm quite flattered.
But Stuart was on the verge of rejecting the rock and roll route to glory and pursuing his original desire to be a painter, a feeling that would intensify after Klaus Voormann persuaded his photographer girlfriend to see the Beatles with him.
The first person I saw was Stuart, who had his back towards the audience. And when he turned round, it just knocked me completely out.
We went day after day, and every day we brought new people. We always had our whole crowd, all the art crowd suddenly turned up in that place. And then they said, come on, Klaus, you have to talk to them. So the next day, I took a record cover I designed and went up to John and said, what do you think of it?
And he said, well, you have got to ask the artist and the family, that's Stuart.
So I went to Stuart and showed him the record cover, and just like that, a conversation started.
And then Klaus asked him to come to our table, and we met for the first time. And I was just shaking. And later on he told me he was shaking as well.
Just recently, I've found the most wonderful friends. I was completely captivated by the charm. The girl thought I was the most handsome of the lot. Here I was, feeling the most insipid working member of the group, being told how superior I looked. This, alongside the great Romeo John Lennon and his 2 stalwarts, Paul and George, the Casanovas of Hamburg.
So about 2 weeks later, or 1.5 weeks later, I asked Klaus to ask them if I could take pictures of them.
Oh, and I ask you very confidentially, ain't she sweet? Well, ain't she sweet? I see a woman.
His face was just absolutely beautiful. So I can still see his face all the time, and you know, the way his eyes were shining, and he was so enthusiastic about life, and the knowledge of life. And that was very, very attractive.
When he took his glasses off, he had beautiful eyes, great-looking guy. A very frail looking and a very sensitive person, very, very sensitive.
Of course, I was dying to be alone with him. So I thought the best way was to ask him to take pictures of him on his own, which I could feel and see he was delighted and would love to be photographed by me. And not only that.
Tomorrow I meet the girl. She's going to take more photos. Perhaps it's my loneliness here, but I find I love her very much. Still, after tomorrow I'll know for sure, as after a whole day in a company, something's bound to happen.
We just fell in one another's arms, we couldn't resist it anymore. And that was it, we both just fell in love and couldn't help it. But Klaus was so understanding.
That those two came together just had to happen. They were happy, and that made me happy too.
I do love a girl, but I'll speak little of her, for my mind would overflow with tenderness. She's like a rose that's run its dark leaves over the wall to look at the sun. Complexion slightly pale, eyes full of fire, and now full of dew. Her hand, white, beautiful and tiny, trembling.
Love me tender, love me true.
Before long, Stuart was showing off, singing Love Me Tender to Astrid, and the new lovers were looking for a place where they could get away from the band, and also where Stuart could paint.
My mother said, I don't want this boy living in this hole there with no bath and nothing. I want him to stay here, And we had quite a big flat. So he had one room and I had another room. We had a big attic above our flat. And he asked my mummy if he could use it as a studio. So of course my mother said yes, and she said, what do you need? And she bought him all the paint and all the canvas and everything he wanted. And my cousin made him an easel, so he could really do his bit up there. So whenever he came home, he went just into the flat and drank a glass of milk, and then up he was again. Up to in the morning when my mother went up and saw him asleep on a stool.
Living with Astrid, painting whenever he could, Stuart would miss band rehearsals, infuriating Paul. But this was the aesthetically adventurous Stuart that Lennon loved.
They were quite intelligent lads, whereas most of the rock bands in those days were as thick as pig shit, to be honest with you.
I mean, for people like myself and the Beatles, it was very important to feel well, we've got a bit of culture. We went to grammar school, and we went to art school, and we're not nincompoops like the rest of the rock and roll bands are, they're fucking idiots, So Stuart was sort of a bridge between the musicians, which were the Beatles and myself and a few others, and the arty crowd in Hamburg, the art school, basically.
Stuart was achieving something on a certain artistic level that John really wanted to achieve too.
He read a lot and he wrote a lot, which fascinated John. So that all, I do believe, came to this fantastic respect he had towards Stuart.
Talent oozed out of him without him doing anything much. And John had to sort of really work hard to make the talent that he had, which was not a little either, but to get it over and say, well, here's my talent too, guys. I think it was a little envious of Stuart in that sense.
They really loved one another, which for me was not unusual, even in the beginning of the 60s. But for other people it was, you know, they had the connection like, oh, when two boys are so close, they must be homosexual, which to me is very, very silly.
He didn't tell me, and John didn't tell me, but other people write about it, and they claim that John told them. If that gets transposed into, oh, Stuart and John had homosexual encounters, if I say they might have done, that's as far as I go.
What kept these two guys together was some sort of mutual attraction. I don't know how far it went. I'm not interested in what went on at night when the light was out or whatever. But there was some sort of love thing happening there, I'm very sure.
I know people are saying there was sort of a homosexual relationship, but there wasn't. They were just good mates.
Because this story has become as much myth as history, there is a suggestion that Lennon, during one of his Jekyll and Hyde rages, kicked Sutcliffe in the head, a beating that possibly led to Sutcliffe's eventual illness.
In my last book with Douglas Thompson, we actually quote other people, including John himself, who gives a graphic account of that event. And yet, there are as many people who believe or want to believe that it didn't happen.
John never, ever raised his hand towards Stuart. That is absolutely rubbish.
I heard from other people, yes, he beats them up. But I never asked John about it. And I have never heard it during the time when they were here in Hamburg. But if other people know better, I don't believe it.
Whatever issues were going down between them, must have been forgiveness there, if that was needed. And they maintained a hugely intimate relationship, as always.
I will spend my whole life through loving you.
In his new studio, Sutcliffe was painting as if for his life. Meanwhile, in the Beatles' new accommodation, John's behaviour gave no obvious clues as to his future as an icon of peace and togetherness.
The Beatles stayed here in the two-room flat with two of them in each room, and it was a little bit different. There were balconies outside. You could step from the room into a balcony, and there it was that morning when people went down the street to go to the church, and John Lennon was standing on the balcony and peeing over the balcony because he had a little party upstairs and there was only one toilet seat like, and he had to go very badly to the toilet, and he took his wee-wee over the balcony and he peed on somebody's heads, you know. I don't know if it was the hats or on the clothes or anyway, and that were people who went to the church and they got annoyed about it, called the police, and the police came, and there was this pee-pee trouble we had then later on.
He used to take the piss out of the Germans, something ruthless, you know. John would go on stage with a lavatory seat round his neck and curse the Germans and say, "We won the war."
In December 1960, the Beatles once again received a visit from the Hamburg police. George was just 17, too young to work. He was immediately deported. Once they were cleared of charges of attempted arson on their former sleeping quarters in the cinema, John, Paul and Pete followed. Stuart stayed behind with Astrid. In January, he planned to return to Liverpool and introduce Astrid to his family.
I can remember the very first time I set eyes on Astrid, when she came to our house, and I thought she was beautiful. She was everything my brother had written to us about and described, and they clearly were madly in love with one another.
I knew Mrs. Sutcliffe didn't like me very much. Probably because I was German. You know, it was just the 60s, and we were the enemies in the war, and I don't know why.
What was Stuart, 20? She thought it was too young, and that he'd just had his head turned, you know, got dizzy with all that excitement in Hamburg.
We had a townhouse, and they knew we had plenty of room. They turned up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and Astrid was in tears. She couldn't take any more. So she stayed at our house for the whole of her stay while she was in Liverpool.
After some lively performances in Liverpool, the Beatles were offered more work in Hamburg. Stuart returned in advance of the group to be with Astrid, who had started to exert an influence over more than one musician in Hamburg.
A word from her was sort of would keep you high for a week. If she said something nice about you or a compliment, or she gave you a tip, say, well, why don't you grow your sideboard down a bit longer than everything? You know, she had this certain way of speaking, and made you feel great.
She was not only this beautiful girl, she was this mother figure. She turned into this mother figure, which they needed so badly. They were far away from home, they didn't have any friends, there was nobody to really look after them.
She had an immense influence on the Beatles, say, if you want to talk about them later. Sort of, the rough edges disappeared. If you asked, what would the Beatles have been like without knowing her, it would have been pretty different. It was obviously advantageous to listen to this woman, because she was the muse for all of us.
To tell you the truth, everyone loved Astrid. You know, she, like in a school, there's one girl, you know, and in Hamburg with all the musicians, there was Astrid, of course. You know, even other musicians, when Astrid said something, Astrid said this and Astrid said this, yeah.
Everybody was in love, if you sort of in an infantile way, with Astrid. I can remember Paul and Stuart having a fight on stage because of Astrid. Stuart was already involved with her, but Paul would rather have, it was him, it wasn't.
Paul was playing piano, and Stu just put his guitar down, went up to the piano and just went right in Paul's face.
I remember him getting up from the piano and jumping on Stuart, and not fighting like a guy, but fighting like a chick. Paul will forgive me. No, he won't. But, you know, with the claws and, you know, the sort of...
Stuart's heart was less and less with the Beatles. The pace was too much. Art and Astrid took up his time. Paul felt that Stuart was more an indulgence of John's than a committed full-time Beatle, and he was losing patience.
I knew Paul had it in for him, and Paul was beginning to challenge John for the leadership of the group, and it was only a matter of time.
To Paul, I think it was a little difficult because he felt we need a better bass player.
John just turned round and said, it doesn't matter, he looks good. So, and that finished the argument.
They're really rocking in Boston, Philadelphia, PA, deep in the heart of Texas, and down in Frisco.
His musical abilities weren't that great, but as a rock and roll bass player, I thought he was incredible. He was really, really sufficient, and he had this rock and roll feeling, which is sometimes much more important than being able to play all thousands of notes. With all those rock and roll songs, most of them are just 3 chords, and he did it perfect for me.
For the moment, Stuart's position in the band was safe, and inspired by Astrid, he was about to drop the James Dean quiff for an arty combed-down hint of the mop top that would eventually be the defining Beatles image.
This bleeding haircut is so unimportant as far as their career is concerned. All my friends in art school had this haircut, especially Jürgen Vollmer, another photographer. But Klaus had this handicap. He had his ears were sticking out a lot. So I thought, what can I do to make this beautiful face even more beautiful. So I told him to let his hair grow over his ears, and I cut it for him.
I personally never liked that. I didn't want to wear my hair in the front of my face. I didn't like it. But Astrid got me to do it eventually.
Stuart said, "Oh, I would love to have this haircut." So, because his hair was long, it was just all combed back. So I just got the Brill cream out, washed it, and cut it for him.
Astrid cut Stuart's hair in the shape of a mop head. And when he turned up that night with his strange haircut, the others just fell about the stage laughing and taking the mickey out of him.
And he wore my collarless jacket. So John just said, "Oh, have you got your mum's jacket on?"
Stuart's ideas were slowly accepted by the others, and the prototype Beatles flickered into view. But his art and his love for Astrid meant more to him than being a Beatle. The reality of love and art appeared to win over the illusion of fame and fortune.
I see so many things in my mind, things that only need to be made concrete, and they'd be good.
It was Stuart himself who suddenly decided, I don't want to do this rock and roll music. I don't want to be in a band. As much as I love rock and roll, my art is so important to me. That's when he decided, I just have to quit.
He really, really did think the Beatles were going to make it. Without any doubt at all. And I believe he thought he was going to remain part of their world. Not as a performer on stage with them, but part of their world in some way, artistically.
John was very, very sad about it, that his friend wasn't with him anymore in the band. I think Paul was quite happy because...
Stuart wanted to get married to me as soon as possible, but without him earning money, for him that was not possible. So he wanted to do his Bachelor of Arts either in Germany or in England. He got a scholarship in Germany, which was very rarely done then for a not German person, but which was not enough for us to live on. That is why he left the Beatles then, to become a student of the College of Art in Hamburg.
I've worked hard for the last 2 weeks and have quite a lot of work which I'm pleased with. I feel quite aggressive towards any critics. I'm mounting the best of my work for examination by my tutor. All of it's far superior to what I would have done a year ago.
Sutcliffe's talent was constantly maturing. His impetuous work reflected the urgent need of a post-war Europe for fresh energy and new ideas.
He is what I would call a late abstract expressionist, and it's very interesting that he was in Germany. Hamburg was an exceptionally dynamic city. Germany was defeated, it had this terrible reputation, and yet it was very vital. I would say he was trying to work through some emotional issues. I would argue that what you have in Stuart was an effort to make contact with his primary creativity, and that is visceral, and that comes out as, quote, raw emotion, raw expression. Such painting is really psychosomatic. It's body, mind together. That's the fantastic thing about abstract expressionism, that there's no separation.
The symbols are the same throughout all the pieces. This particular work was one of my mother's favourite pieces, and she had this in her sitting room. Some people go to look at his exhibitions because of the Beatle connection. Some reviewers go reluctantly. They think, oh, you know, we've got to go and cover it because he was in that famous band. And quite often they get a huge surprise.
In a very short span of time, he produced an incredible body of work. There's no question.
You know, I'm not sort of pushing a boulder uphill, saying, you know, look at this work, it's fabulous. That was started by other people before me.
It's really as good as the best of the second generation abstract expressionists. And I think it would have gotten better. If he stayed in Germany, it would have gotten, I think it would have been really major.
Tell your mama, tell your pa,
Back home in Liverpool, Lennon could sense that the new-look Beatles were onto something. But all on his own, he decided that Alan Williams was not the manager to take them forward. It was time for a change.
John was refusing to pay my commission. And so I said, I'll fix that, you'll never ever work again. Well, it was me never worked again. By that time they'd met Brian Epstein, who'd become their manager.
Seeing their potential, Brian Epstein put the final commercial touches to the Beatles. He turned the provocative downbeat look of Astrid and Stuart into something a little neater and sweeter, packaging Scouse insolence as jolly mischief. Paul McCartney was now on bass. Ringo Starr was soon to replace Pete Best on drums. Meet the Beatles, the Fab Four, vaguely haunted by Stuart's gentle soul. Stuart didn't regret leaving the group, but something else was causing concern.
As you've so often remarked on how thin I am, Astrid's mother arranged for me to go to a very good doctor for a full examination. The doctor said I'm a nervous wreck. In his whole experience, he's never seen anyone like me and can't believe it. Anyway, I'm in the best hands in the world, so you mustn't worry.
In the summer of '61, Stuart started to report in letters to Mother various symptoms, you know, like weight loss, or his eyesight wasn't so good, or whatever. But they were just like little bits of scattered symptoms here and there.
At first he used to say, oh, this headache makes me crazy. So my mother called our doctor, our house doctor, and he examined him. First they thought he had migraine, but that wasn't what they thought. And then it went on and on and on, his headaches. And one day they brought him home from art school, he fainted. My mummy again thought that is not the way it should be, and they had x-rayed him.
At one point my mother made arrangements for Stuart to come back and see a consultant in Britain. He reneged at the last minute, and the consultant wrote to my mother and said that it was no great deal that he hadn't come, because from the x-rays and the blood and so on, his opinion was that he was a young man with an autistic temperament.
He then felt better, but then one day they brought him back from school again. He fainted. We wouldn't let him go to school then again. But then, of course, he went again. He said, I feel better, I want to go, you know.
I returned to college today. I will start painting again next week. I really hope to stage an exhibition before the end of the year. That's for certain.
These works were done in the last year of Stuart's life. I'm told by people that the red ones come across as angry and fiery, and the dark ones as somber and almost like a death knell. And that's not my perception of them. One could say that, you know, they're dark, somber tones, but they are so balanced and so beautifully executed. Did he know he was going to die? Are these his last statements? Well, they may be.
There is a sense of trauma in his art. There is a sense of trauma, and that's particularly fascinating. I mean, it just comes through. This guy was suffering, okay? I would think he was transcribing his suffering in the painting. I mean, it's as simple as that.
His art kept him going up to the last moment of his life. Whenever he felt better, he was either up in his attic or in art school.
He just kept on going, and that is really admirable. I mean, you know, that's really strong will. I mean, this guy had will and spontaneity as well.
He definitely was trying to carry on painting, but he was physically not capable of doing it after a while. It was getting more and more difficult. He got up sometimes for a while, but he could never stay up long. He had to go and lie down again.
I'm very ill. Bedbound. I can't walk very far without falling over. The thing is these headaches. I can't sleep till the doc comes and injects me. Meanwhile, I go mad. Actually, I'm costing hundreds. The tablets alone. Everyone looks after me fine and chops me food into little pieces. I can't stand being ill. If it happens again, I'll go berserk. Anyway, forgive me for now. The incoherence and everything. But it's killing me writing.
It was difficult for me to cope with it, to see this beautiful boy in pain. But he was ever so kind and thankful that whenever I was there, when I came home from work, he waited for me, you know, not going to sleep. He told my mother, please wake me up at 6:30 or something, so I'll be awake when she comes home, you know.
I must try and pull myself together. I must try hard. I've had all the drugs in the world. It's so horrible and frustrating. 4 days without sleep, here, hour after hour, scream at the frustration, pain and helplessness. I don't know why I can't sleep. I've had the right doses and then again, but nothing doing. Still very ill. I'm really sad that I can't write more clearly and precisely. Sometimes the pain is too much. I can't take it anymore. Astrid's worn out. I can't help it. I can't sleep. This pain's killing me.
My mother phoned me and said, you've got to come home. He's not well at all. So I came home and he was in bed already, very, very pale. And my mother by the time had called the doctors. And the doctor came and said, well, I can't handle that anymore. We have got to call the ambulance. And I went with him in the ambulance to take him to hospital. And I've had the feeling something was going on. And he just moved up from in the hospital, in the ambulance, and he held me, and then he just, you know, slipped back, and that was when he died.
I found out about my brother's death on the 10th of April in 1962 via a phone call that my mother made to a friend to tell me to come home. And I can remember waiting at the bus stop in the pouring rain and just trying to take in the information. Your brother is dead. I was numb. I couldn't take it in, couldn't conceive of what that meant.
For Pauline Sutcliffe, there are still questions to be answered about the cause of Stuart's death.
The post-mortem reported on the indentation in the skull and the bleeding in the brain, the hemorrhage, as if there had been a trauma.
They found out that he had a hemorrhage in the brain which overflooded his brain, and that was the cause of his death. The next day, after Stuart's death, I went to the airport to pick up Mrs. Sutcliffe, who flew in then from Liverpool. But at the same time, John, Paul and Pete were waiting to pick up George and Brian Epstein from the airport, who had the same plane as Mrs. Sutcliffe. So George already knew that Stuart died. But when I arrived at the airport with Klaus, John and Paul and Pete were there already, wait for George and Mr. Epstein. So they were all jumping up and down and cuddling me and being pleased to see me. And when I told them that Stuart died, Pete just bursted out in tears. Paul was just holding me, you know, in his beautiful way. And John just freaked out. He completely freaked out. He freaked out as far as just laughing until tears came.
I was dreaming of the past.
Whatever combination of love, fear or guilt caused such a reaction in John, Stuart's death crushed him, forcing him to turn completely to Paul for artistic and emotional truth, until he could no longer even rely on that and turned to Yoko. Perhaps Stuart's death stayed with him all his life. Sometime later at Astrid's house, John asked to be photographed in Stuart's attic studio, posed just like his lost friend had been.
I didn't mean to hurt
When he died, it really was like losing a brother. It was really quite tragic. He was to be my best man, but unfortunately it never happened. And he left me with a lot of very good memories. It's just a pity he's not here now.
Take me to your heart, for it
He was my older brother, but now he's my kid brother. You know, I want to look after him and protect him. Would love to know, you know, how he would have grown up.
When Stuart was gone and I was on my own, at first it took me a while to realize that he is gone. And I must admit I still have got a picture of Stuart on my bedside, which whenever his birthday is, or there is a flower next to it.
Tell me you are mine.
I think Stuart was a very, very special person. He had great gifts and he had great ways to express himself. And I'm sad that there is hardly a piece of film, hardly anything to show what this person was like.
Love me true, all my dreams.
Stuart is my life and my youth, and I have never met a man like that before, and I will not. To meet this outstanding person was a blessing for me.
More rock and roll history from Liverpool still to come tonight. Liverpool on the Box continues with a Rock Family Trees double bill. Next.